The dog stopped walking so suddenly that Ryan Walker almost stepped over him. For one breath, nothing seemed unusual. Denver International Airport was still roaring with the tired impatience of a winter travel day. Suitcases rattled across the polished floors. Parents bent over strollers. Businessmen argued softly into Bluetooth headsets. Somewhere above Gate C27, an airline employee announced another delay in a voice that sounded like she had already apologized 100 times that morning. Then Valor froze. Not slowed down. Not hesitated. Froze. The 6-year-old German shepherd stood in the middle of the concourse with one front paw lifted, his ears forward, his body locked in a kind of silence Ryan knew too well. It was the silence of a trained military dog who had found something that mattered. Ryan tightened his grip on the leash. "Valor," he murmured. "What is it?" The dog did not look at him. He stared past a row of irritated passengers, past a pile of carry-on bags, past a young mother wiping applesauce from a toddler's coat, and fixed his amber eyes on a woman sitting alone beside the window. "Before we go any further, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city or state in the comments. Because stories like this always seem to touch people from places we never expect. And if you believe loyalty can survive time, distance, and even silence, subscribe and stay with this story until the end." What happened in that airport would leave a retired nurse crying, a former Navy SEAL questioning everything he thought he understood, and dozens of strangers standing still in the middle of one of the busiest terminals in America. The woman Valor was staring at sat near Gate C27 with a paperback novel open in her lap, although she had not turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. Her name was Margaret Collins. She was 62 years old, though her face carried more than years. It carried night shifts, hospital corridors, overseas dust, and the kind of memories that did not show up on medical charts. Her wheelchair was angled toward the huge window overlooking the runway. Outside, snow blew sideways across the tarmac, turning parked aircraft into ghostly shapes. Behind the glass, de-icing trucks crawled beneath gray light. Ground crews moved with their shoulders hunched against the wind. Inside, the terminal was warm, loud, and crowded, but Margaret felt the cold anyway. She had always felt it more on days like this. Her flight to Phoenix had been delayed twice. Her sister had called once to ask whether she was okay, and Margaret had lied the way people lie when they are tired of making others worry. "I'm fine," she had said. Then she had tucked the phone into her purse, placed one hand on the worn leather wallet resting beside her coat, and looked out at the snow. Nobody noticed her. That was normal. Airports had a way of shrinking lonely people. Everyone was late, hungry, annoyed, or busy checking a screen. A woman sitting quietly in a wheelchair by a window became part of the furniture. A coat, a suitcase, a body in a seat. Margaret had not always been invisible. There had been years when people called her name with urgency. "Nurse Collins. Ma'am, we need you." Years when a room changed the moment she entered it because she carried medicine, clean bandages, steady hands, and a voice calm enough to keep frightened men from falling apart. But that was a lifetime ago. Now she was a retired military nurse with arthritis in both hands, a bad hip, and a wallet full of things nobody asked about anymore. Several gates away, Ryan Walker was trying not to be irritated. He had survived deployments, freezing surf during SEAL training, bad intelligence, helicopter noise, and nights in places most people would never see on a map. He could handle a delayed commercial flight. At least that was what he kept telling himself. At 39, Ryan still carried the posture of a man trained to read exits before menus. He had left active duty 3 years earlier, but the habits remained. He noticed unattended bags. He noticed aggressive voices. He noticed which travelers were anxious and which were hiding something. He noticed every uniformed officer in the terminal before most passengers noticed the coffee shop. Beside him walked Valor, the dog who had saved him from more than one kind of darkness. Valor was large, dark-faced, and powerfully built, with the disciplined calm that made people step aside without knowing why. He wore no dramatic vest, only a working harness and a collar with a metal tag that clicked softly when he moved. Some children pointed at him. A teenage boy asked his mother if it was a police dog. A man near a charging station pulled his feet back as if Valor might judge him personally. Valor ignored all of them. Ryan had raised him from a puppy after buying him from a respected breeder who specialized in military working dog lines. The breeder had handed Ryan a thick folder of documents, which Ryan had skimmed with the practical interest of a man who cared more about temperament than ancestry. Valor had been intelligent, steady, and fearless. That had been enough. Over time, he became much more than enough. Ryan's flight had been delayed from noon to 3, then 3 to 4, and now the airline was refusing to make promises. Every seat near the gate was taken. People had colonized the floor with backpacks and fast food bags. Ryan scanned the area and finally spotted one open chair beside the woman by the window. "Looks like that's our lucky spot, buddy," he said. Valor kept pace beside him until they reached the row of seats. Margaret looked up as Ryan approached. She saw the dog first, then the man holding the leash. Something about Ryan's posture told her military before she noticed the faint shape of a trident tattoo near his wrist. "Ma'am," Ryan said, "would you mind if I sat here?" Margaret closed the book in her lap. "Of course not," she said. "Please. Seems like every chair in Colorado is taken today." Ryan smiled. "Feels that way. Thank you." He set his backpack down and began to sit. That was when Valor stopped breathing with the world. Ryan felt the leash go tight. At first, he thought the dog had caught a scent connected to food, medication, stress, or another animal. Valor had been trained to ignore distractions, but airports were messy places. Ryan looked down, ready to correct him quietly. Then he saw the dog's face. Every muscle was focused on Margaret. Not threatening, not suspicious, not playful, focused. Margaret noticed it too. Her smile faltered. She glanced down at herself as if she might have spilled something. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. "No," Ryan said, though he was no longer sure of anything. "He doesn't usually do this." Valor took one slow step toward her. Ryan did not stop him. Years of working around military dogs had taught him that certain instincts deserved a moment before correction. Valor was not lunging. His tail was low but relaxed. His ears were up. His eyes had softened, but his attention did not break. A few people nearby began to notice. A businessman paused with his laptop half open. The young mother across from them held a cracker in the air while her toddler waited, confused. An elderly couple stopped whispering about their connection in Chicago. Valor took another step. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of her wallet. For a second, Ryan saw something pass through her expression. It was too quick to name. Surprise, maybe. Or fear. Or recognition before the mind had permission to recognize anything. Valor stopped directly in front of her wheelchair. Then he lowered his head and rested it gently on Margaret Collins' knee. The movement was so tender, so deliberate, that no one spoke. Margaret looked down at the German shepherd as if a door had opened inside her chest. Her hand rose, stopped, and hovered over his head. "Well," she whispered, trying to smile, "you certainly know how to introduce yourself." Ryan stared. Valor had been around veterans with missing limbs, frightened children, police officers, nurses, grieving families, and crowds large enough to make most dogs anxious. He had comforted people before. He had leaned against Ryan during nights when Ryan woke up sweating from dreams he refused to discuss. But he did not choose strangers. He did not cross invisible lines without reason. "I'm sorry," Ryan said. "I honestly don't know what he's doing." Margaret placed her hand on Valor's head. The dog closed his eyes. Ryan felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. It was not dramatic. No one gasped. No music swelled. Flights kept boarding. Snow kept falling. But the space around them changed. Travelers slowed as they passed. The gate agent looked up from her computer. A little girl tugged her father's sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, that dog loves her." Margaret heard it. Her mouth trembled. "Maybe he's just kind," she said. "He is," Ryan replied. "But not like this." Valor breathed out slowly against Margaret's lap, the way a dog breathes when he has finally reached a safe place. Margaret stroked his fur with fingers that remembered before she did. The texture, the warmth, the weight of a working dog's trust. She had not touched a German shepherd like that in years. Not since a dusty medical station half a world away. Not since a night she had folded carefully into memory and tried not to disturb. Ryan sat down beside her, still watching Valor. "I'm Ryan," he said. "Margaret Collins." "Nice to meet you, Margaret." I wish I could say Valor does this all the time, but he doesn't. At the sound of his name, Valor opened one eye, then settled closer against her wheelchair. Margaret smiled through the confusion. "Valor, that's a strong name. He earned it." She looked at Ryan more carefully. "Military." Ryan nodded. "Navy. Retired. SEAL." He blinked, surprised. That obvious? Not obvious, she said. Familiar. The word landed softly between them. Ryan studied her. You served? Not the way you did. I was a nurse. Military medical support. 26 years. Valor's ears lifted. Ryan saw it. Margaret saw it too. The dog raised his head from her knee and stared at her face with such stillness that the young mother across the aisle actually stopped feeding her child. Margaret swallowed. That's impossible, she whispered. Ryan leaned forward. What is? She did not answer right away. Instead, she opened the leather wallet in her lap. It was old, creased, and carefully kept. Not expensive, but loved in the way some objects are loved because they hold what a person cannot afford to lose. Inside were travel documents, insurance cards, folded receipts, and photographs protected in cloudy plastic sleeves. Margaret's fingers moved past them with practiced care until they found one picture tucked behind a faded military challenge coin. She removed it slowly. The photograph had yellowed at the edges. In it, a younger Margaret stood outside a canvas medical tent beneath a sky the color of dust. Her hair was pulled back. Her scrubs were wrinkled. Her smile looked exhausted but real. Beside her sat a German shepherd wearing a K9 harness, alert and proud despite a bandage wrapped around one front leg. Ryan looked from the photograph to Valor. The resemblance was not exact. The dog in the photo had a broader head and a darker saddle. Valor's muzzle was sharper, his eyes lighter. But there was something there. A posture, an expression, a gravity in the face. Who was that? Ryan asked. Margaret touched the image with her thumb. His name was Ranger. Valor's ears came forward. No one near them missed it. Margaret's hand began to tremble. Ranger came into our station after a night nobody wanted to remember, she said. His handler was badly injured. 2 other men too. The dog had shrapnel wounds, dehydration, burns on his pads from running over hot ground. He should have collapsed before they ever reached us. But he didn't. Ryan listened without moving. Margaret's voice changed as she spoke. It became steadier, lower, as if some old part of her had stepped back into uniform. The medics brought the men in first. That's how it had to be. We had blood everywhere, radios going, generators cutting in and out. I remember someone shouting for plasma. Someone else was crying for his brother, even though his brother wasn't there. Ranger was at the entrance of the tent, fighting everyone who tried to move him away from his handler. Not biting, just refusing, planting himself there like his body was the last door between danger and the man he loved. Valor shifted closer to her. Margaret looked down at him and blinked away tears. The veterinarian finally sedated him enough to treat the wounds, but he fought sleep. Even after surgery, he kept lifting his head to look toward the recovery cot where his handler was lying. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't settle. Every time someone walked past, he tried to get up. And you stayed with him, Ryan said. Margaret gave a small, sad smile. I was supposed to be off shift. I had been awake nearly 30 hours. But something about him. I don't know. He looked so tired, so determined. Like he believed if he closed his eyes, the world would take someone else from him. Ryan looked down at Valor. He knew that looked too well. So I sat beside him, Margaret continued. I put my hand on his head and told him his handler was alive. I don't know why. He couldn't understand the words. But I told him anyway. I told him he had done his job, and now it was our turn. Valor lowered his chin back onto her knee. Margaret inhaled sharply. Ranger did that, she whispered. Did what? That exact thing. The first night he finally slept. He rested his head on my knee just like that. Ryan wanted to find a clean explanation. Dogs liked comfort. Dogs responded to calm voices. Dogs could smell age, medication, old leather, peanut butter crackers, and a purse. There were explanations for almost everything if a person worked hard enough. But Valor had not smelled a story. He had stopped in a crowd and chosen her. Margaret reached into the wallet again and removed a second photograph. This one showed her kneeling beside Ranger outside the same medical station. Her arm was around the dog's neck. Ranger's head was turned slightly toward her, eyes half closed, his body leaning against her leg with unmistakable trust. On the back, faded handwriting read, Nurse Collins and Ranger. Task Force 7. You save more than you know. His handler gave me that before they left, Margaret said. Captain Daniel Hayes. He was young, too young to have seen what he had seen. When he recovered enough to stand, Ranger wouldn't leave his side, but he kept coming back to me too. 3 weeks. That's how long they stayed. 3 weeks of that dog walking between his handler's cot and my chair like he was checking whether all his people were still breathing. A man sitting 2 rows away lowered his newspaper. An airline employee stopped pretending to rearrange boarding passes. The elderly couple across the aisle leaned toward each other, but neither spoke. Ryan noticed them, but Margaret did not. She had gone somewhere else. Every night after my shift, I would sit outside the tent with him. It was cooler then. The heat would finally break, and the whole camp would get quiet except for generators and distant aircraft. Ranger would lean against my leg. Sometimes I talked to him because I didn't have anyone else I could tell the truth to. What truth? Ryan asked softly. Margaret looked at the runway. That I was scared. That I was angry. That I was tired of putting brave faces on boys who were barely old enough to rent a car. That I could patch bodies and still not know how to repair what were did to their eyes. Ryan's jaw tightened. He had never liked hearing civilians call military nurses angels. It made their work sound soft and glowing. He had seen nurses hold arteries closed with their hands. He had seen them make impossible decisions in seconds. He had seen them stand in blood and keep their voices gentle. Margaret had been one of those people. Ranger listened, she said. That's what it felt like. He listened. And every night, before he fell asleep, he nudged my hand 3 times. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then he put his head down. At those words, Valor stood. Ryan felt the leash shift. Margaret froze. Valor stepped closer, lowered his nose to Margaret's hand, and nudged it. Once. Twice. 3 times. The terminal seemed to go silent. Not literally. A boarding call still echoed near Gate C27. A child still cried somewhere behind them. A suitcase will still squeaked over the floor. But for the people close enough to see it, sound seemed to fall away. Margaret covered her mouth. Ryan did not breathe. Valor simply lay back down beside her wheelchair as if he had done the most ordinary thing in the world. No, Margaret whispered. No, that can't be. Ryan stared at his dog. He had never taught Valor that. No trainer had. No handler had. It was not a command, not a trick, not a behavior pattern Ryan had ever seen from him. Valor might nudge a hand for attention, but not 3 times with that slow, deliberate rhythm. Not after a stranger described it. Margaret's eyes filled. Ranger did that every night, she said. Every single night. Ryan rubbed one hand over his mouth. Margaret, I don't know what to say. Neither do I. A gate agent walked over slowly. Her name tag read Denise. She looked embarrassed to be interrupting, but her eyes were wet. Ma'am, Denise said gently. I just wanted to make sure everything is okay. Margaret gave a trembling laugh. I don't know if okay is the word. Denise looked at Valor. I've worked here 13 years. I've seen service dogs calm panic attacks, find lost kids, detect seizures before they happen. But I've never seen anything like that. Ryan nodded once. Me neither. Denise hesitated, then placed a hand over her heart. Whatever it is, it feels like something good. She returned to the gate counter, wiping her cheek before she turned around. Margaret unfolded another item from her wallet. It was a brittle piece of paper with military letterhead at the top and a signature near the bottom. The folds were soft from decades of being opened and closed. They gave me this after Ranger and Captain Hayes shipped out, she said. A commendation. I kept meaning to frame it. Then life happened. My husband got sick. My mother moved in. I left one hospital for another. There was always something more urgent than honoring an old version of myself. Ryan looked at the paper. To Nurse Margaret Collins, it began, in recognition of extraordinary dedication and compassionate service under difficult operational conditions. She did not read the whole thing aloud. She did not have to. Most people think service is one big heroic moment, Margaret said. A medal, a rescue, a headline. But most of the time it's just staying awake when your body is begging you to stop. It's changing bandages. It's holding a hand. It's remembering that the person in front of you is someone's son, brother, husband, daughter. Her voice caught. Or someone's dog, Ryan said. Margaret smiled at him then, grateful that he understood. Yes, she whispered. Or someone's dog. Valor lifted his head and pressed his nose against her wrist. She closed her eyes. For years, Margaret had carried those photographs like proof of a dream. Sometimes she wondered whether she had made Ranger larger in her mind than he really was. Memory could do that. Loneliness could do that. Grief could polish ordinary moments until they shone brighter than truth. But this dog, this stranger's German shepherd in a crowded airport, was making her old memories feel less like relics and more like living things. Ryan glanced toward the departure board. His flight still showed delayed, though boarding was rumored to begin soon. For once, he was grateful for airline incompetence. "You asked if I knew Valor's background," he said. "I know some of it. His breeder gave me paperwork. Working line. Military dogs going back several generations. I have the records stored on my phone, at least scans of the main pages." Margaret went very still. "Military working line? Yes. Could Ranger be in it?" Ryan started to answer with caution. The odds were small. There were countless military dogs. Names repeated. Records got incomplete. Breeding programs changed hands. He did not want to give her hope he could not support. But Valor looked from him to Margaret, and Ryan opened his phone. "Let's check what I have." His fingers moved through folders, veterinary records, training certificates, licensing documents, old photos of Valor as a clumsy-eared puppy. He found the pedigree file and opened it. The screen filled with names, registration numbers, kennel codes, and abbreviations he had barely cared about years ago. Margaret leaned closer, adjusting her glasses with one trembling hand. "I don't remember every number," she said, "but I might have something." From her wallet, she removed a small laminated card so old that one corner had peeled. On it was a photograph of Ranger standing beside Captain Hayes, both of them looking directly at the camera. Beneath the image were lines of type: Military Working Dog Ranger. Handler, Captain Daniel Hayes. Unit attachment. Registration and bloodline identifier. Ryan stared. The bloodline code looked familiar. Not the whole number. Not enough to prove anything yet. But the prefix, the kennel mark, the working line designation. He had seen it before. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Captain Hayes gave it to me the morning they left," Margaret said. "He told me if I ever wanted to know what happened to Ranger, that card might help." "Did you try?" "Once." Her eyes lowered. "Years later. I wrote to an address that no longer existed. Called a number that had been disconnected. Then my husband got diagnosed, and after that life became doctors, bills, treatments, insurance forms, and trying to pretend I wasn't afraid. By the time I had room to look again, I didn't know where to start." Ryan understood that kind of postponement. People imagined unfinished business stayed waiting politely. It did not. It sank under life until one day a person woke up and realized the years had passed. He zoomed in on Valor's records and scrolled down. Grandsire. Great-grandsire. Foundation working line. There it was. Ranger. Not just any Ranger. The registration number matched the old card except for a suffix used in later breeding records. The dog in Margaret's photograph was listed as a direct ancestor in Valor's line. Ryan turned the phone toward her. Margaret stared at the screen. For several seconds, her face did not change. Then the meaning reached her. Her lips parted. Her hand rose to her chest. "He was real," she whispered. Ryan frowned gently. "Of course he was real. No, I know. I just..." She gave a broken little laugh. After enough years, when nobody remembers what you remember, the past starts to feel like something you carried alone. Seeing his name there, she looked down at Valor. "Your family came back." Valor met her eyes. A stranger behind them sniffed loudly and pretended to look for something in his backpack. The elderly woman across the aisle wiped both cheeks. The young mother pulled her toddler closer and whispered, "That's why we have to be kind, sweetheart. You never know where it goes." Ryan heard her and felt something shift in his chest. He had spent years believing loyalty was something trained, tested, and earned in the present. But here was another kind. A loyalty that seemed to move through bloodlines, through gestures, through stories nobody had spoken aloud. He did not know whether Valor recognized Margaret through scent, intuition, some inherited echo of behavior, or a mystery no science could comfortably hold. Maybe the dog had simply responded to something in Margaret that matched something in Ryan. Old pain. Quiet courage. A need to be seen. Maybe that was enough. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small plastic sleeve of peanut butter crackers. Ryan laughed despite himself. "You carry those in airports?" "My blood sugar drops sometimes," she said. Then her smile became shy. "And I suppose old habits are hard to kill." Valor sat upright. Ryan's smile faded. Margaret saw it too. "Ranger loved these," she said. "Well, the version we had in the cafeteria. They were terrible. Dry as chalk. But every night after my shift, I'd sneak him one. Regulations said no. Common sense said maybe. He had been through enough." She opened the sleeve. Before she could offer the cracker, Valor placed one paw gently on the blanket covering her lap and waited. Margaret stared. That, she whispered, was how he asked. The gate area around them had given up pretending not to watch. Even people who had no idea what had happened felt the weight of the moment by watching those who did. Margaret handed Valor the cracker. He took it carefully, without teeth, then settled back beside her chair. Exactly where Ranger used to settle. Margaret laughed and cried at the same time. You good boy, she whispered, the phrase slipping out from a place older than thought. You brave good boy. Valor's tail moved once against the floor. Ryan looked away toward the window because he suddenly needed a second. Outside, snow blurred the runway lights. Aircraft waited with wings glazed white. Somewhere, thousands of people were angry about delays, missed meetings, lost luggage, and hotel vouchers. Ryan had been one of them that morning. Now he wondered how many delays were only delays, and how many were life quietly rearranging its pieces. Margaret folded the cracker wrapper with the care of someone returning from sacred ground. What happened to Captain Hayes? Ryan asked. Her smile faded. I never knew. His last letter said he and Ranger were stateside for training, and Ranger was doing well. He sent a picture of him running through a field. After that, nothing. The letters stopped. In those days, when a connection broke, it broke. People moved. Units changed. Addresses vanished. You didn't have social media to find everyone. Do you want to know? She looked at him, startled by the directness. I used to think I did, she said. Then I became afraid of what I might find. Ryan nodded. He knew that too. Sometimes not knowing preserved a person. Sometimes an unanswered question was the only version of hope someone could bear. But today, Margaret continued, looking at Valor, I think I know enough. Ranger lived. He mattered. Something of him came forward. Maybe that's all the ending I needed. The loudspeaker crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning boarding for Flight 418 to San Diego. Ryan looked up. His flight. Reality returned with boarding groups, carry-on restrictions, and people suddenly remembering they were late. Margaret smiled, but sadness crossed her face. That's you, isn't it? Yeah. You shouldn't miss it. Ryan glanced at Valor, then back at her. I feel like walking away right now would be rude to the universe. Margaret laughed, and the sound was lighter than before. The universe will forgive you. Airlines are less generous. Ryan tore a page from a small notebook in his backpack and wrote his phone number on it. You are not disappearing, he said. She accepted the paper with both hands. That sounds like an order. Occupational hazard. What if I become a terrible pen pal? Then Valor and I will file a complaint. Her eyes softened. Thank you, she said. Ryan shook his head. I didn't do anything. You stopped long enough to listen. At my age, that's not nothing. He had no answer for that. Margaret placed the phone number inside her wallet, between Ranger's photograph and the old commendation letter. Then she leaned down as much as her body allowed and scratched behind Valor's ears. I don't know what you remembered, she whispered to the dog. Or how. But thank you for finding me. Valor pressed his forehead against her hand. Ryan stood and shouldered his backpack. Several passengers moved aside without being asked. Some nodded to Margaret. One man in a Broncos hoodie touched 2 fingers to his cap. Denise, the gate agent, smiled from behind the counter with red eyes. Ryan and Valor walked toward the boarding lane. Halfway there, Valor stopped again. Ryan, look down. I know, he said softly. He loosened the leash. Valor turned, walked back to Margaret, and gently nudged her hand 3 times. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he returned to Ryan's side. Margaret's face crumpled with gratitude. Goodbye, Valor, she said. The German shepherd looked back once before stepping onto the jet bridge. Hours later, above the snow-covered Rockies, Ryan sat by the airplane window while Valor slept at his feet. Cabin lights were dim. Most passengers had pulled down shades or given up on conversation. Ryan looked at the dark glass and saw Margaret's face reflected there, the moment she had read Ranger's name in Valor's records. He had spent much of his life around proof. Coordinates, mission briefs, intelligence reports, training logs. After leaving the Navy, he had tried to build a civilian life out of measurable things, appointments, routines, bills, miles run each morning, tasks completed before noon. But the most important thing that had happened to him in years could not be measured cleanly. A dog had stopped walking. A woman had opened a wallet. An old kindness had stepped out of the past and sat down beside them. Ryan looked at Valor. You knew something, didn't you? He whispered. Valor did not wake. Ryan smiled. Maybe some mysteries did not need to be solved. Maybe solving them would make them smaller. What mattered was that Margaret Collins had boarded her own flight later that evening with her shoulders less heavy than they had been that morning. What mattered was that a retired nurse who thought the world had forgotten her service now had a phone number in her wallet and proof on a stranger's screen that Ranger had lived on. What mattered was that kindness had found its way back. Back in Denver, Margaret did not move for a long time after Ryan and Valor disappeared down the jet bridge. The people around her slowly returned to their own problems, but something gentle remained in the air. A man who had been complaining about his missed meeting offered to get her coffee. The young mother asked if she needed help reaching the restroom before boarding. Denise came from behind the counter and quietly printed Margaret a new boarding pass after another gate change, then walked with her all the way to the new waiting area. Margaret kept thanking them, almost embarrassed by the attention. But beneath the embarrassment was something she had not felt in years. She felt present, not useful in the old medical sense, not responsible for anyone, simply present, as if the world had finally turned its face toward her and said, I see you. On her flight to Phoenix, she held the worn wallet in both hands during takeoff. Usually she hated that part, the hard climb through clouds when the engine strained and the ground disappeared. That evening, she barely noticed. She opened the wallet just enough to see Ranger's photograph tucked beside Ryan's phone number. The old dog looked back at her from another century, another continent, another version of her life. You made it home, she whispered, too softly for the passenger beside her to hear. For the first time in a long time, she did not cry because something had been lost. She cried because something had been returned. Ryan felt the change too. After landing in San Diego, he stood outside the terminal while other passengers hurried into rideshares and shuttles. Valor leaned against his leg, tired but alert, watching the automatic doors slide open and closed. Ryan had promised himself years ago that he would not become a man who chased signs in every coincidence. War had taught him how dangerous imagination could be when fear took over. But this was not fear. This was wonder, and wonder was a feeling he had nearly forgotten how to allow. That night, back in his apartment, he pulled out the original folder the breeder had given him when Valor was a puppy. It had been stored in a plastic bin beside old training gear, tangled leashes, and a cracked food bowl Valor had outgrown before his first birthday. Ryan spread the papers across the kitchen table. Valor sat beside him, chin resting on the chair, as if supervising the investigation. The records were more detailed than Ryan remembered. Names, pairings, health clearances, working certifications, notes from handlers who cared about bloodlines the way some families cared about ancestry. He found Ranger's name again, then again in a supporting document. Not a myth, not a coincidence of spelling. Ranger had been there all along, printed in black ink, waiting for Ryan to care enough to read the story behind the name. Ryan took a photo of the page and sent it to Margaret before he could overthink it. It was past midnight in Colorado, too late to expect an answer. Still, 2 minutes later, his phone rang. Margaret did not say hello. She only said, read it to me. So Ryan did. He read every line slowly while Valor lay beneath the table, listening to the sound of a name that had crossed decades to find them. When Ryan finished, Margaret was quiet. Then she said, I spent half my life believing that goodbye was the end of that story. Ryan looked down at Valor. Maybe it was only the middle, he said. 3 months later, Colorado looked like a different world. The dirty snow along the roads had melted. Grass returned in bright, stubborn patches. Cottonwood trees shook out new leaves beside creeks swollen with runoff from the mountains. The sky over Colorado Springs stretched wide and blue, the kind of sky that made even old grief feel less permanent. Ryan drove south that Saturday morning with Valor in the back seat. The windows cracked just enough for cold spring air to move through the truck. On the passenger seat lay a folder he had printed the night before, Valor's full pedigree, Ranger's registration line highlighted, and copies of every photograph Margaret had sent him after the airport. They had spoken almost every week since Denver. At first, the calls were practical. Ryan sent the documents. Margaret sent clearer photos of Ranger's card. They pieced together dates, names, and unit markings. Ryan reached out to 2 former handlers he knew, then to an old contact who had worked around military dog programs. Nothing happened quickly, but small answers surfaced. Ranger had survived his injuries. He had returned stateside with Captain Hayes. Later, after retirement from active work, Ranger had been placed into a breeding and training program for military working lines before eventually living out his last years with a Handler family in Texas. When Ryan told Margaret, she had gone quiet for so long that he thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "He had a home?" "Yes," Ryan told her. "From what I found, a good one." Margaret had cried then, not loudly, not helplessly, but with the relief of someone setting down a question she had carried for half her life. After that, the calls changed. They talked about things beyond Ranger. Margaret told Ryan about her husband, Paul, who had died after a long illness and never once complained unless the hospital coffee was bad. Ryan told her a little, then a little more, about leaving the Navy and not knowing who he was without orders to follow. Margaret listened the way she once listened beside a medical tent, without rushing, without fixing, without turning his pain into advice. Sometimes Ryan called only so Valor could hear her voice on speaker. The first time he did it, Margaret said, "Hello, handsome," and Valor walked across the room, sat in front of the phone, and stared at it until Ryan laughed so hard he had to sit down. The military appreciation event outside Colorado Springs had not been Ryan's idea at first. Denise, the gate agent from Denver, had somehow connected with a veterans group after posting a careful version of the story without names. People wanted to honor military medical personnel and working dogs. Ryan would have ignored it, but Margaret surprised him. "Maybe we should go," she said. "You want to?" "No," she admitted. "But maybe that's exactly why I should." So Ryan picked her up from her sister's house that morning. Margaret came out wearing a navy blue cardigan, small pearl earrings, and a silver pin shaped like a caduceus on her collar. Her wheelchair folded into the back of the truck. Valor greeted her by resting his head in her lap before Ryan had even closed the door. "There you are," she said, rubbing his ears. "I was wondering when you'd come collect me." The event was held in a community park with mountain views, folding chairs, flags, food trucks, and a small stage decorated with photographs of service members from different eras. Children ran through the grass with red, white, and blue balloons. Veterans stood in clusters, some in ball. Caps embroidered with ships or units, others in faded jackets that still fit their shoulders like memory. Margaret became quiet as Ryan pushed her wheelchair along the paved path. "You okay?" he asked. "Too many ghosts," she said. "We can leave." She shook her head. "No. Ghosts deserve fresh air too." Valor walked on her left side, close enough that his shoulder brushed the wheelchair now and then. People noticed him immediately, but something about his calm presence made them approach gently. A retired Marine asked permission to pet him and ended up telling Margaret about a Labrador who had slept outside his hospital room after Fallujah. A former Army medic recognized the look in Margaret's eyes and simply said, "Ma'am, thank you for what you carried." Margaret could not answer for a moment. Ryan watched her receive kindness like someone relearning how. The program began with speeches, a color guard, and a local high school choir singing the national anthem. Margaret sat near the front with Valor at her feet. Ryan stood behind her chair, hands folded, scanning the crowd out of habit. Halfway through the event, an organizer named Elise stepped to the microphone. "Today," she said, "we want to recognize a kind of service that too often happens outside the spotlight. The kind that takes place in field hospitals, recovery tents, late-night wards, and quiet rooms where someone chooses to stay when everyone else has moved on." Margaret's hand tightened on the armrest. Ryan looked down. She whispered, "Ryan?" He said nothing, because if he did, she would hear the truth in his voice. Elise lifted an enlarged photograph. It was Margaret and Ranger outside the medical tent. A murmur moved through the crowd. Margaret stared as if the past had been lifted into daylight. "This is Nurse Margaret Collins," Elise said. More than 30 years ago, while serving overseas in military medical support, she cared not only for wounded service members, but for a military working dog named Ranger. The records show her care directly contributed to his recovery. The people who served with her remembered her steadiness. The documents remembered her actions. And, in a way none of us can fully explain, Ranger's own bloodline led a dog named Valor back to her in an airport terminal this winter. A few people turned to look at Valor. The German shepherd sat up straight beside Margaret's chair. "Some services loud," Elise continued. "Some services decorated. Some service is written into official reports. But some service is quiet. It is a hand on a frightened shoulder, a nurse staying past her shift, a promise whispered to a wounded dog that he can rest because someone else is keeping watch. Today we honor that quiet service. We honor Nurse Margaret Collins. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then the applause began. It started in the front row and spread like weather. Veterans stood first, then families, then children who did not fully understand but knew something important was happening. Soon the whole crowd was on its feet. Margaret covered her mouth with both hands. Ryan leaned close. Breathe. She laughed through tears. I'm trying. Valor stood and placed his head gently on her knee. The applause grew louder. Margaret was not crying because people were clapping. She was crying because for decades she had believed that part of her life had vanished into dust, paperwork, and silence. She had believed her memories were private rooms no one else could enter. Now hundreds of strangers were standing for the woman she had once been, the woman who had stayed awake, the woman who had told a wounded dog that it was safe to sleep. Elise came down from the stage with a framed copy of the photograph and a small plaque. Margaret accepted it with shaking hands. I don't deserve all this, she whispered. An old veteran in the front row heard her. Ma'am, he said, his voice rough. Most people who deserve it say that. Margaret looked at him and nodded, unable to speak. Later, when the speeches ended and people wandered toward food trucks and shaded tables, Margaret asked Ryan to take her somewhere quieter. He pushed her chair along a path beneath cottonwood trees until they reached a small rise overlooking the mountains. The late afternoon sun had turned the peaks blue and gold. Valor lay in the grass near Margaret's feet, finally relaxed after. Accepting admiration like a patient celebrity. Margaret held the framed photo in her lap. I used to think recognition meant someone calling your name in public, she said. A certificate. A ceremony. Something official. Ryan sat on the bench beside her. And now? She looked at Valor. Now I think recognition is when life brings something back to you and says, see, it mattered. Even if nobody said it at the time. Even if you almost stopped believing it yourself. Ryan let that settle. A breeze moved through the trees. Children laughed in the distance. Somewhere behind them, a man was telling a story too loudly near the barbecue truck, and people were laughing anyway. Margaret opened her wallet and removed Ranger's old photograph. She placed it beside the framed copy, then glanced at Valor. He doesn't look exactly like him, she said. No, but he feels like him. Ryan nodded. Yeah, he does. Valor lifted his head as if he had heard his name inside the silence. Margaret patted her lap. Come here, handsome. Valor rose, walked to her, and rested his head against her hand. She scratched behind his ears, slow and gentle. You know, she said, after Ranger left, I thought the lesson was that we don't get to keep what we love. Military life teaches you that. Hospitals teach you that. Death certainly teaches you that. People come in, you help them, and then they're gone. You learn not to ask for endings because endings rarely ask your permission. Ryan looked toward the mountains. What do you think now? Margaret smiled. Now I think maybe love doesn't always stay in the form we recognize. Sometimes it comes back as a phone call, or a stranger asking to sit beside you, or a dog stopping in the middle of an airport because something in him knows something in you. Ryan swallowed. He thought of all the men he had lost, all the names he carried without saying them. He thought of the nights Valor had woken him from nightmares by pressing his body against the bed. He thought of Margaret sitting alone by the window, believing the world had moved on without her. Maybe everyone was waiting to be remembered by someone. Maybe loyalty was not only the act of staying. Maybe sometimes loyalty was the act of returning. The sun lowered behind the mountains, turning the edges of the clouds orange. Margaret took one peanut butter cracker from her purse and held it up. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Still breaking regulations? I'm retired, she said. They can court-martial me if they find the paperwork. Valor placed one paw gently on her blanket. Margaret laughed, full and bright this time. Some habits really do run in the family. She gave him the cracker. He took it carefully and settled beside her wheelchair, exactly as Ranger once had, exactly as if the world had folded 30 years into one quiet evening. For a while, none of them spoke. They did not need to. The mountains held the light. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods. In the distance, the last applause of the day faded into ordinary sounds. Car doors, children calling for parents, veterans saying goodbye in parking lot voices. Margaret looked at the old photograph one final time before sliding it back into her wallet. "I used to be afraid everyone would forget," she said. Ryan looked down at Valor, then at the framed picture in her lap. "They won't." She smiled. "Maybe not. But even if they do, I understand something now. What we give doesn't disappear just because people stop talking about it. Kindness keeps moving. It travels through people, through choices, through memory, maybe even through dogs." Valor sighed and closed his eyes. Margaret rested her hand on his head. Ryan watched them and thought about the delayed flight, the crowded terminal, the empty chair, the dog who refused to keep walking. He thought about how close they had come to missing all of it. One different gate, one earlier boarding call, one available seat somewhere else. 100 ordinary details could have kept Margaret alone with her memories and Ryan moving through life without knowing why his dog carried a piece of another story. But sometimes life is not as careless as it looks. Sometimes the thing that frustrates us is the thing making room for a miracle. A delayed flight, a crowded airport, a woman nobody noticed, a dog who did. As the last sunlight slipped behind the mountains, Margaret leaned down and whispered the same words she had spoken decades earlier in a dusty medical station far from home. "You did your job, brave boy. Now rest." Valor closed his eyes beneath her hand. And in that quiet moment, Ryan finally understood that the greatest mystery had never been whether Valor remembered Ranger, or whether bloodlines could carry habits, or whether a dog could sense a kindness done before he was born. The real miracle was simpler. A woman had once stayed beside a wounded dog when no one ordered her to. Years later, another dog stayed beside her when she needed to know her life had mattered. The world forgets names. It misplaces records. It lets good people sit alone in crowded rooms. It moves too fast past quiet sacrifice. But kindness leaves tracks deeper than memory. And sometimes, if the heart is patient enough, those tracks find their way back home.